Hey there, welcome back. This is Austin, and this is Animal Quests. In this episode, I will uncover the most horrifying shark attacks ever recorded. From a field technician alone in a flooded river where the water offered zero visibility, to an underwater welder working at dusk while a scent trail drifted through the dark water around him. Let's start with the first story, where 5 people stepped into a cage that had already been quietly failing before it ever touched the water. It was May 5th, 2026, and the morning off the coast of Gainesby came in with heavy swells and a flat gray sky that turned the water dark and opaque. Visibility was poor, and the sea state sat right at the edge of what most operators consider workable. Not unsafe on paper, but close enough that every margin matters. Rael Duvenhage, 34, a content creator from Oregon, had built his channel on controlled risk. Lately, growth has stalled. He wasn't failing, but he wasn't breaking through either. A live shark cage dive in rough water felt like the kind of escalation that could reset momentum. He arranged the shoot with a local operator willing to accommodate extra equipment. The cage hadn't been rebuilt, but it had been altered. Slightly widened bar spacing in a few sections for cleaner sightlines, plus added mounting points for cameras. The changes had been treated as cosmetic, not structural. Maintenance logs had already noted corrosion at several upper joints and weld points. Not critical yet, just flagged for repair. Deferred. 5 tourists entered despite a 4-person rough water limit. Priya Delaney, 31, a photographer from London. Luis Ortega, 28, a software engineer from Spain. Megan Pike, 33, a travel blogger from Florida. Carter Bell, 26, a former athlete with a habit of pushing past warnings. And Rael, who had secured lights, cameras, and battery packs along the frame. No one recalculated the load or how it would shift under motion. Honestly, I think that's where this locks in. Nothing dramatic, just a system quietly moving outside its design limits. As the cage was lowered, it didn't settle cleanly. It yawed with each swell, the support cable above cycling between slack and sudden tension. That repeated loading matters more than people think. It doesn't break things instantly. It weakens them, especially at compromised joints. Chum went into the water. At one point, bait was thrown closer than standard distance, tightening the movement around the cage. A large female great white shark, an apex predator built for explosive speed and power, cut through the waterline toward the bait. At nearly the same moment, a trough dropped the cage while the winch line snapped taut. The load shifted upward and sideways at once, forcing stress directly into the already corroded upper welds. One of those weld points failed. The cage didn't collapse. It racked, twisting out of the square. Inside, everyone was thrown hard into the bars. Priya was driven backward and upward at an angle, the back of her head striking a cross support with enough force to cause immediate loss of consciousness. Luis was forced downward as the cage dipped partially under the surface again. With the frame no longer square, load redistributed unevenly. Bolted connections along one modified section began to shear under torsion. The bars didn't bend cleanly. The joints gave way first, allowing a section to warp and flex. The gap wasn't open. It pulsed wider and narrower with each wave. Water surged in hard. Megan became pinned between angled supports. Rael tried to pull Luis upward, but the shifting cage kept forcing them down and off balance. Above them, the winch operator hesitated, reading the uneven tension as temporary swing rather than structural failure. The lift continued in short corrections, causing the cage to rise at an angle instead of evenly. One corner lifted higher while the compromised side dragged deeper, worsening the distortion with each adjustment. Carter was thrown sideways during another rotation. He braced instinctively, but his arm became trapped through the warped section as the cage rolled again. Visibility was near zero in the churn, timing, position, and entrapment, lining up in the worst possible way. When the shark passed back through the same tight space created by bait and current, it intersected that position. Not a strike, not a decision. The result was immediate and catastrophic. I think this is the part people get wrong. They picture a single violent moment. It wasn't. It was cumulative stress, deferred maintenance, added weight, and unstable conditions, all resolving in seconds where nothing was corrected in time. It took additional time to stabilize the line and bring the cage up in controlled stages. By the time it fully cleared the surface, Priya remained unresponsive. Rael was recovered shortly after prolonged submersion during the delayed lift. CPR was started immediately on board, but neither could be revived. Priya was pronounced dead from blunt force trauma and drowning. Rael died following extended oxygen deprivation despite resuscitation efforts. Carter survived but lost his arm below the elbow. Megan and Luis were recovered alive, both with crush injuries and severe near-drowning complications. Fragments of the live stream spread briefly before being removed. The investigation later confirmed over-occupancy in rough conditions, deferred corrosion repairs at critical weld points, and baiting distance violations. The operator's license was permanently revoked. Honestly, I don't think the defining factor here was the shark. It was the quiet accumulation of decisions, each one small, each one explainable, until the system stopped having any capacity left to absorb failure. Rael and Priya didn't die because of the shark. They died because of deferred maintenance, overcrowding, and decisions that each seemed small until none of them could be taken back. The next story is quieter. A single person, alone, in a river where the water is murky, the current is fast, and the sharks are already there. It was September 9th, 2016, along the Zambezi River, in a stretch of floodplain, overtaken by seasonal overflow. The water was the color of wet clay, moving fast and carrying everything the land had surrendered: sediment, debris, uprooted vegetation. Visibility near the surface was already poor. Below the waterline, it was effectively zero. Eloan Mireth Varga, 31, was a field audio technician contracted through a small environmental research outfit specializing in freshwater acoustic monitoring. She wasn't a diver or a field biologist. She was the person who made sure the equipment worked: hydrophones, cables, signal recorders. She understood sound better than she understood rivers, and that distinction mattered more than anyone acknowledged before she entered the water. The flooding that season had been heavier than projected, pushing several hydrophones out of position. Someone needed to go in and adjust them. Honestly, I think this is where it starts. Not a bad decision, just a routine one that nobody questioned. The rest of the team stayed upriver, assuming she'd be back in a few minutes. No one maintained line of sight. It wasn't dramatic negligence. It was the kind of assumption that forms when something has worked enough times that it stops feeling like a risk at all. She waded in alone toward the hydrophone, working along a shallow bank that dropped abruptly into a deeper channel just a few feet ahead, the kind of drop-off where footing gives way without warning and the current pulls harder toward the channel. In clear water, that edge would have been visible. In flood conditions, it wasn't something you found until you were already past it. In river systems like this, large predators don't need visibility to locate movement. Bull shark, a stocky, highly adaptable predator, known for tolerating fresh water and using electroreception to detect prey in murky conditions, has been documented far inland, especially during high water conditions when access routes expand. They rely on electroreception, detecting the electrical signals produced by muscle movement, allowing them to investigate targets at close range in completely opaque water. The attack happened at that edge where the riverbed dropped away. As her footing gave way into the deeper channel, the sudden displacement of water and rapid movement coincided with the shark's approach. The initial contact was forceful and close range, not a clean strike, but a crushing bite to the lower body that immediately destabilized her. The water around her churned violently as she tried to regain footing, but the current was already pulling her off balance. There was at least one additional contact in the seconds that followed. Not a prolonged feeding event, but a rapid, chaotic sequence of bite and release behavior, typical of investigatory attacks. The injuries were catastrophic. Severe tissue damage and rapid blood loss occurred almost immediately, compounded by the current dragging her further into the channel. With no stable footing and no visibility, there was no opportunity to orient herself or escape the area. By the time the water settled, there was nothing visible from the surface to indicate what had just happened. Her absence was noticed within several minutes, but locating her took longer. The team moved along the bank, searching through debris and murky water until they found her caught against submerged vegetation, partially held in place by the current. Basic first aid was attempted, but the extent of blood loss made intervention impossible in the field. The remoteness of the location delayed evacuation, and she was pronounced dead before reaching the nearest clinic. The research project was suspended. The organization released a brief internal statement and quietly closed the site. No footage existed. The recording equipment she had gone in to adjust remained submerged, capturing nothing useful. Her name appeared in a regional incident log, and little else. A regional log entry, a closed site, like the river just swallowed everything and moved on. The Zambezi took Eloan not with spectacle, but with the efficiency of a predator operating exactly within its environment, unseen, immediate, and over before anyone else realized it had begun. The next story moves to the open ocean, a charter vessel, a hooked fish thrashing at the surface, and a predator built for speed that gave no one on deck nearly enough time to react. It was January 28th. 2013, off the coast of the Azores, a remote Portuguese archipelago about 900 miles west of mainland Europe. The water felt deep, open, and indifferent, with long, slow swells rolling beneath a clear sky and manageable wind. On paper, it was a good day to be out. Riven Callis Thorne, 42, had been running charter fishing trips out of a small private operation in the Azores for over a decade. No large outfit, no corporate backing, just a vessel, a reputation built through word of mouth, and a client list that kept returning. He was known for running trips that felt personal. He handled lines himself, stayed close to the action, and encouraged clients to engage directly with the catch. To me, that hands-on approach was probably exactly why people booked with him. It was also the thing that put him closest to the water when it mattered most. The Azores sits within a pelagic corridor, open ocean habitat where large migratory species move through regularly. Bluefin tuna, wahoo, and billfish were common targets. So were the predators that followed them. Encounters with large pelagic species near the vessel weren't unusual, and most experienced operators had protocols for managing active catches near the gunnel. Riven had been doing this long enough that those protocols had become second nature, and I think that's exactly where the danger hid. Not in ignorance, but in the kind of comfort that makes you stop running through the checklist. That morning, the group had been working a productive stretch of water for several hours. Multiple fish had been brought alongside without incident. The clients were engaged, the mood was relaxed, and the rhythm of the trip had settled into something familiar. Then, a large fish struck one of the lines and the dynamic shifted. The fish ran hard before tiring, and by the time it was being worked toward the surface, it was still fighting. At the gunnel, it thrashed violently, the kind of erratic, desperate movement a hooked fish produces when it has nowhere left to go. Riven moved in to manage the line manually, leaning over the side to control the retrieve. What was also happening beneath the surface, unnoticed, was a response to that same struggling fish. Short-fin mako sharks are among the fastest fish in the ocean, capable of extremely rapid bursts of speed. They are highly attuned to the erratic movement and low-frequency vibrations produced by distressed prey, signals that travel through open water and draw them in from significant distance. A hooked fish thrashing at the surface is, in almost every measurable way, an ideal stimulus. Makos don't approach cautiously. When they commit to a feeding response, they move directly and without hesitation. The shark struck the hooked fish at the surface. In the confusion of that contact and the violent thrashing that followed, the water around the gunnel became immediately chaotic. Riven was leaning over the side, managing the line, directly within range of that disturbance when it happened. The contact with him occurred not as a targeted strike, but within the chaos of the surface thrash, position and timing intersecting in the worst possible way. By the time the situation changed, he was already inside it. The injuries were severe. The vessel was offshore, well beyond the range of rapid emergency response, and onboard medical capability was limited to basic first aid supplies. The crew pulled him back onto the deck immediately and worked to control the bleeding. A distress call was made. Despite continued attempts to manage the bleeding, he succumbed before any assistance could reach them. Not the attack itself, but the distance. The ocean doesn't care how far you are from help. The clients on board were physically unharmed. The vessel returned to port under the crew's management. Local maritime authorities documented the incident and conducted a standard review. One of the clients had been recording video on a personal device during the trip and reportedly captured portions of the incident. The footage was surrendered to maritime authorities during the review process and was never released publicly, retained as part of the official documentation. The charter operation closed in the months that followed, not by official order, but because there was no one left to run it. For me, the hardest part about this story is that Riven likely believed he was doing exactly what he had always done. He had spent over a decade reading that ocean well enough to keep clients safe and coming back, and experience slowly convinced him the variables would remain manageable. Riven leaned over that gunnel because it was what he had always done, and nothing had ever told him to stop. Until one morning, something came up from below faster than any amount of experience could account for. His story is a reminder that sometimes the danger doesn't come from a decision you can trace back and correct. The next story shows that sometimes you don't even have to be in the water at all. Sometimes the ocean just takes you in the dark when no one is watching. It was July 30th, 2018, somewhere in the Central Pacific, the kind of open water that doesn't have landmarks, doesn't have edges, and doesn't offer anything to hold on to. The night sky and the ocean surface blur together out there in a way that makes it difficult to tell where one ends and the other begins. The vessel was a commercial cargo ship running a standard trans-Pacific route. The water temperature was warm, the swells were moderate, and the night shift had been moving without incident. Nothing about that evening suggested it would end differently than any other. Iskra Velinova Petrescu, 36, worked in cargo auditing aboard the vessel. Her job was documentation, manifests, inventory reconciliation, load verification. She was not a deckhand, not a navigator, and not someone whose role required her to be near the outer railings during nighttime operations. She had been with the shipping company for several years, rotating through different vessels on transoceanic routes. The work was isolating by nature, weeks at sea, limited communication with the outside world, and a daily routine that rarely changed. The outer deck at night was not part of that routine. I think that detail matters more than it might seem at first. The exact sequence of events that led to her going overboard was never fully established. Nighttime operations on cargo vessels involve movement across deck areas that are not always well lit or continuously monitored. Whether she lost footing, misjudged a step near the railing, or encountered some other circumstance was not something the subsequent review could determine with certainty. What the review did establish was that she went into the water unwitnessed, and that her absence was not immediately noticed. That gap between when she entered the water and when anyone realized she was gone is where everything that followed became increasingly difficult to reverse. The vessel continued on its heading. No alarm was raised. No one on the night shift registered that anything had changed. Iskra was alone in the open ocean, in darkness, with no flotation device and no signaling equipment. The water was warm enough to delay hypothermia. Under different circumstances, that might have worked in her favor. Here, it only extended the duration of her exposure while the probability of survival decreased rapidly with time. Oceanic white-tip sharks are a known presence in Central Pacific pelagic zones. They have been documented in historical maritime incidents involving prolonged open ocean exposure and have been observed to investigate and sometimes circle surface disturbances over extended periods. Oceanic white-tip sharks can grow to about 6 feet and are known for persistently investigating surface disturbances in open water. No interaction was confirmed here, no remains, no witnesses, but it's hard to ignore what shares that environment, even if only as context. Her absence was discovered when a crew member attempted to reach her for a documentation matter and found her quarters empty. A search of the vessel confirmed she was not on board. The timeline reconstructed afterward suggested she had been in the water for an extended period before the search began. By that point, the conditions around her had created increasing risk with every hour that passed. I keep thinking about that window, the hours between when she went in and when anyone noticed. In open Pacific water at night, that window doesn't stay open long. A search and rescue operation was initiated after the vessel raised the alarm. The search area in open Pacific water at night covered a range that made recovery effectively impossible. No physical evidence was recovered. The incident was formally recorded, and the company reviewed deck access and crew monitoring procedures. The area she likely went overboard from wasn't covered by cameras, so no footage existed. For me, the hardest part about this story is that Iskra didn't make a dramatic decision. She didn't take a calculated risk or push past a warning. She simply ended up in the water, alone, in the dark. Iskra's story is a reminder that in open water, the danger doesn't always require a mistake. Sometimes it only requires time, darkness, and distance from anyone who might have helped. The next story moves closer to shore, but proximity to land offered no real advantage because the predator was already there, moving through shallow, murky water long before anyone entered it. It was November 2nd, 2015, along South Africa's KwaZulu-Natal coast, where rough surf and poor visibility are common. Recent rainfall and river outflow had reduced visibility to about 1 to 2 meters, 3 to 6 feet, and concentrated baitfish near shore. The current was uneven, the water murky, and the light still low when Tavian Xerxes Malcor entered the water. Tavian, 27, was an underwater photographer working independently along the KwaZulu-Natal coast. He wasn't attached to any publication or research institution. He sold his work through a small personal portfolio and a modest online following. He specialized in capturing predator activity in dynamic environments, actively seeking out conditions most divers avoided. To me, that's what separated him. He was willing to go where the shot was, even when the conditions made it complicated. He had been working this coastline for several months, building familiarity with local water patterns and seasonal behavior. That familiarity had been reinforced by months of successful dives in similar conditions, and I think that's the part worth paying attention to. Not that he was reckless, but that experience had quietly narrowed the gap between caution and confidence. The rainfall earlier that week had altered the environment in ways not immediately visible from the surface. River outflows along this stretch concentrate baitfish near shore, and where baitfish concentrate, larger predators follow. The current near the outflow pushed debris and sediment in unpredictable directions, and the water carried the kind of murk that makes every shape below the surface uncertain. Tavian entered the surf zone without a dive partner, though a spotter remained on the beach tracking his position intermittently. He timed his entry between wave sets, managing the camera rig through the surf before moving toward the area where baitfish activity had been visible from shore. Looking at this now, the combination of factors that morning was more significant than any single one of them. The outflow, the baitfish, the low visibility, each one manageable on its own. Together, they were something else. Bull sharks are a year-round presence here, with activity increasing in murky, low salinity conditions and concentrated bait fish. In low visibility, they rely on electroreception and pressure sensing, and a diver repeatedly surfacing can produce signals that draw close-range investigation, often faster than it can be detected from above. Tavion had been in the water for approximately 20 to 30 minutes, repeatedly diving and resurfacing to capture footage of the baitfish activity below. The irregular movement pattern continued in water where visibility offered almost nothing beyond arm's reach. The shark struck laterally at close range and disengaged immediately after the bite, consistent with investigatory behavior in low visibility conditions. The injury was significant, major vascular damage to his lower body. This is the part that stands out. Proximity to shore did not translate to survivability. The spotter on the beach registered the disturbance in the surf zone and raised the alarm immediately. Bystanders entered the turbulent surf despite the risk and brought Tavion to shore within minutes. Attempts were made to control the bleeding, while emergency services were contacted. Despite the speed of the response, the blood loss could not be managed with the resources available on the beach. He lost signs of life despite continued attempts at resuscitation and was later formally pronounced dead. His camera equipment was recovered from the water later that day. The footage was reviewed as part of the incident documentation and was not released publicly. For me, the hardest part about this story is that Tavion understood that environment better than most people who enter that water. He had spent months learning that coastline, and experience slowly convinced him the variables would remain manageable. Tavion entered that water because the conditions that made it dangerous were the same ones that made the shot possible, and that calculation had worked before. His story is a reminder that familiarity with a place is not the same as control over it. The next story shows that sometimes the danger in the water is what you unknowingly bring into it. It was July 8, 2013, near Monterey Bay, California. The morning arrived cold and gray beneath a heavy marine layer, and the kelp beds shifted beneath the surface with the swell. Visibility offshore changed constantly as moving currents pushed darker water through the thick patches of kelp. That summer, water temperatures along the California coastline had been lower than usual. Seal activity had increased near several coastal feeding areas, and reports of juvenile and subadult great white shark sightings closer to shore had become more common. Experienced divers were paying attention. Most had already started adjusting where and how they entered the water. Some avoided certain kelp beds entirely during low visibility mornings. Others stopped carrying fish directly attached to their bodies after several close encounters had circulated through local diving communities. Cy Hale, 27, did not. Cy worked as a commercial spearfisherman and had spent years diving the Monterey coastline. People who knew him described him as highly capable underwater, calm in rough conditions, and extremely confident in his own judgment. But honestly, there's a specific kind of danger that comes from doing risky things successfully for too long. Eventually, surviving starts feeling like proof that the warnings don't apply to you anymore. Cy had developed a reputation for ignoring safety recommendations he considered overly cautious. One habit stood out in particular. He frequently dove alone in areas where most experienced spearfishers strongly preferred working in pairs. He also dismissed most shark concerns, not because he thought sharks didn't exist, but because he believed the actual risk was exaggerated. And after years of successful solo dives, he had enough confidence behind him to trust his own judgment over everyone else's. In the weeks leading up to July 8th, several divers had discussed increased shark sightings along sections of the Monterey coast. A local fisherman had even warned Cy days earlier after spotting large shadows moving through one of the kelp channels near sunrise. Cy entered the water anyway. That morning, he carried several recently speared fish attached directly to a waist stringer clipped beside his body. Among experienced spearfishers, that practice is widely discouraged in areas with known shark activity because bleeding fish create a concentrated scent trail directly connected to the diver. Personally, this is what makes the situation feel grounded. Nothing Cy did was unusual on its own. Solo diving, waist stringers, dense kelp. Divers do those things all the time. It's when they combine under the wrong conditions that situations turn dangerous. The kelp beds Cy moved through that morning were thick enough that visibility constantly shifted, depending on current movement and light filtering through the surface. At times, divers could only see a few feet ahead before the water darkened again between the kelp stalks. A nearby fishing crew had noticed unusually heavy seal activity along the outer kelp line earlier that morning. Several seals had been moving erratically before abruptly disappearing deeper offshore. offshore. Sai continued diving farther into the kelp. Large sharks are known to investigate silhouettes, splashing, and irregular movement patterns in low-visibility water, especially in areas containing seals or struggling fish. At some point later that morning, the nearby fishing crew heard sudden, violent splashing deeper within the kelp beds. When they looked toward the disturbance, they caught brief, unclear glimpses of a large shape thrashing near Sai's float line before it disappeared beneath the surface. By the time they maneuvered through the kelp toward the area, the water had already gone quiet. Sai's float drifted partially tangled in the kelp, while a dark plume spread slowly through the current beneath it. One member of the crew later reported seeing torn sections of wetsuit material caught along the line, though visibility made it difficult to determine exactly what had happened. Search crews arrived later that afternoon and began combing the kelp beds, while Coast Guard aircraft searched farther offshore. Divers involved in the search described visibility conditions as extremely poor beneath the surface, especially deeper inside the kelp fields. Investigators later concluded the incident was consistent with predatory investigation behavior in low visibility conditions, likely influenced by the presence of attached fish and nearby seal activity. Search teams eventually recovered damaged dive equipment, sections of Saig's wetsuit, his detached float line, and scattered fishing gear within the kelp beds. Limited remains were recovered. The incident intensified ongoing debate among California spearfishers regarding solo diving practices and the use of waist stringers in areas with documented shark activity. Several local diving groups began encouraging newer divers to use floating catch bags positioned farther from the body instead. For me, the hardest part about this story is that Sai probably entered the water believing experience would compensate for the danger around him. But experience doesn't change how predators interpret movement, scent, or silhouettes underwater. Sai carried the attraction beside him into low visibility water, where reaction time favored the predator, a reminder that confidence can become a blind spot and that small layered decisions can quietly lead to irreversible outcomes. The next story shifts to a quieter scene, where a man works alone underwater at dusk, unaware something is tracking a scent trail behind him. It was April 17th, 2014, in the Malay Atoll, a cluster of low-lying islands in the Maldives, where the water is warm and the light drops fast near dusk. What was visible an hour before becomes uncertain, and what was uncertain becomes invisible. That evening, the conditions were unremarkable on the surface. Below it, several things had already shifted. Valrik Dastan Iqbal, 39, was an underwater welder contracted through a small local marine construction outfit working on a pier extension project in the atoll. He was a tradesman, not a recreational diver. His work required operating in confined, low-visibility conditions near submerged structures, and he had been doing it long enough to move through those environments with practiced efficiency. Honestly, that efficiency was probably what made him valuable on a job like this. It was also what made him comfortable in conditions that deserved more caution. The pier extension was on a tight schedule, and the structure had been in the water long enough to attract reef fish. To keep up, Valrik pushed some dives later into the afternoon. There was no consistent shark risk protocol for late-day dives, no dedicated hazard observer beyond standard line supervision, and no deterrent systems in use. This is where the situation started building. Not one decision, but a series of small, reasonable ones. Nearby vessels had been processing fish at the surface throughout the day, routine practice in the area that nobody flagged as relevant to the dive schedule. Tidal movement had been carrying fish waste through the work zone intermittently throughout the afternoon, creating periodic scent trails rather than a constant concentration. By the time Valrik entered the water, those trails had been moving through the area for hours. He entered the water near dusk with a surface tender managing his line and equipment. The light at that depth, at that hour, flattens contrast and compresses distance in ways that are difficult to fully account for from above. Valrik positioned himself against the pier structure to work, facing the surface he was welding. That orientation, fixed, task-focused, facing the structure, significantly limited his awareness of the open water behind him for the duration of the dive. Tiger sharks are a documented presence throughout Maldivian waters. They range widely, move through varied depth zones, and are known to investigate scent cues when those cues intersect with their movement patterns. They are among the larger shark species in the region, commonly reaching 10 to 14 feet in length and weighing between 850 and 1,400 pounds. In low-light conditions, they rely heavily on their lateral line system and electroreception to navigate and investigate unfamiliar signals. I think that's the detail people miss. It wasn't the welder that drew the shark in, it was everything around him, and he happened to be positioned in the middle of it. Tiger sharks often approach cautiously before making contact, though this behavior becomes less consistent in low visibility, scent-active conditions. Any warning in this case would have been limited. A brief pressure shift or movement at the edge of visibility, not enough time to meaningfully react while fixed to the structure. The shark approached from the open water side of the structure. The bite came at close range, a single strike consistent with investigatory behavior in low-light, scent-associated conditions. The injury was consistent with major arterial trauma to the upper leg region. Despite immediate initiation of recovery, extraction from the work position took additional time due to the welding setup and positioning constraints. This is the part that stands out. The response was fast. The distance between fast and fast enough was the problem. The surface tender registered the line disturbance and began recovery immediately. Basic first aid was attempted on the support vessel, but the remoteness of the work site and the distance from any equipped medical facility meant that managing arterial blood loss effectively in the field was not realistic. He died before the vessel reached shore. The marine construction outfit suspended operations at the site. A brief internal review was conducted with findings focused on dive scheduling near active fish processing areas and late-day entry protocols. No footage existed. Underwater welding operations at that site were not recorded. The incident appeared in a regional maritime safety log and was not covered beyond local channels. For me, the hardest part about this story is that none of the individual factors, the schedule, the fish processing, the dusk entry, the limited hazard monitoring, would have been enough on their own. It was the combination, and nobody was looking at the combination. Velric went into that water to finish a job, and every decision that put him there at that hour made sense in isolation. His story is a reminder that in underwater work environments, the variables that matter most are often the ones happening outside the immediate task, and by the time those variables become visible, the window to act on them is already gone.